Chapter 4 looks at translation strategies, procedures and shifts, at least the first part of the chapter does. It's important to distinguish between the three. Translation strategy is an overall approach to the translation which the translator adopts. So the translator might decide to produce a dynamically equivalent text, or a text that retains many features of the source text, a kind of overall strategy. Translation procedure are the small micro-level decisions taken at word level or phrase level. So how is the translator going to deal with this particular item in the text? So that is a translation procedure. And then translation shift, which is central to this chapter, looks at the small changes, linguistic changes which occur moving from source text to target text, and the ways that these can be classified. So looking at Vine and Darwin's classification, for example, of borrowing and calque and literal translation, transposition, modulation. These were attempts to classify the different changes in translation. Of course, these are problematic as well, because it's very difficult sometimes to classify something as a calque rather than a borrowing, and it may also include some form of explicitation, of explanation in the text, or amplification using more words than the original, and so it does get potentially very, very complicated.
What's a calque?
A calque is a type of literal translation which creates a new term in the source text, in the target language. One example I give is Spanish. So the English hard disk of a computer, translated into Spanish, say as disco duro, which means disk hard. So that is it's a literal translation to begin with, which then produces a new expression in the target language, which then is taken up in the target language. Okay. Difference between calque and borrowing. A borrowing is where you borrow the original word. So if the word hard disk was borrowed into the target language as hard disk, that would be a foreign element retained and transferred. Well, I look at the first part of the chapter at the translation product, so you're looking at the source text, target text, and describing the changes. The latter part, briefly, I look at some ways of analysing translation process. So how does a translator get to that product? Right. And I speak briefly about areas such as think aloud protocols, or some experimental strategies. The use now these days of eye tracking to try to look at the translator's reading patterns, or the observation of their use of online or other resources. So that latter part introduces the reader a little bit to some of the ways in which the translator process can be investigated.
Right, that must be quite challenging to pinpoint the translation process itself.
It's extremely difficult to do, but techniques are being refined, and one lesson we may draw perhaps is that a combination of the different experimental procedures can tell us a lot more about what goes on in the translator's mind.